Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something that, well, it touches every single one of us in the UK. The national debt, the taxes we pay, and what some people are suggesting we actually do about it all.
And this really kicked off from a conversation, didn't it, with someone from the Taxpayers Alliance?
Exactly. And for you, the listener, maybe you're looking to get a solid handle on these, let's face it, pretty complex economic issues without, wading through mountains of data.
Yeah, think of this as your shortcut. We're going to try and pull out the key arguments, the potential solutions being talked about around the UK's finances.
Right. Our insights today are coming from excerpts of a recent YouTube interview. It featured John O'Connell from the Taxpayers Alliance.
So our mission really is to understand the current state of play. The UK's finances, the different ideas swirling around about tax and government spending.
And the possible ways forward being discussed.
Mhm.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's maybe start with the scale. The sheer scale of the UK's financial obligations. Because there's this figure that really jumps out. The idea of a real national debt.
Over 12 trillion? Is that-
Yeah, that's the figure they mention. And it's huge.
Right, and that's not just the number you often see splashed in headlines, is it? That includes, what are they
No.
called? Unfunded liabilities?
Exactly. Big one being promises for public sector pensions down the line. Things we've committed to but haven't necessarily put the money aside for yet.
So it's not just some abstract number floating about. How does a figure that big actually impact things for, ordinary people or the future?
Well, when you talk about a debt of that magnitude, 12 trillion, it essentially means that spending decisions made now could have really significant consequences for future generations.
Right, saddling them with the bill.
Potentially, yes. If it's not managed responsibly, the cost of today's spending will have to be borne by those who come after us. It could limit their own choices, their opportunities.
And 12 trillion pounds.
Yeah.
Just to get a sense of scale compared to the economy.
It's massive. It's several times the UK's entire annual economic output, the GDP. The total value of everything the UK produces in a whole year.
Wow. Okay. So to really understand where some of these concerns, these arguments are coming from, it's probably helpful to know a bit more about the group itself, the Taxpayers Alliance.
Absolutely. So the Taxpayers Alliance, they were founded back in 2004,
Okay.
which, if you remember, was a time when the new Labour government was really quite dominant.
Right.
And their central idea right from the start has basically been that lower taxes are generally a good thing for the economy and for individuals.
And that high spending makes that difficult.
Exactly. High or crucially inefficient government spending makes it much harder to achieve lower taxes. That's their core belief.
And they weren't just, writing dusty reports where I get the impression they were quite proactive in trying to get their message out there.
Precisely. Yeah, they do put out detailed research papers, absolutely. But the Taxpayers Alliance also has this history of more public-facing campaigns.
Like stunts and things.
Yeah, stunts, local activism. Think about them getting involved in really local issues like how often your bins are collected or the state of the roads, potholes.
Ah, connecting the big picture to everyday stuff.
That's it. It's a way of linking those everyday frustrations that people feel directly to the broader principle of, being careful with public money, highlighting that every bit of spending, however small it might seem, adds up.
I think I read something about their early days. Something involving newspaper clippings. Does that ring a bell?
It does, yeah. What's interesting is that back in 2006, apparently one of their first big moves to get attention was literally cutting out newspaper articles.
Really?
Yeah, articles they felt highlighted wasteful spending. By compiling these sort of tangible examples of what they saw as misuse of taxpayer funds, they created a really clear, relatable way for the public to understand their concerns.
Huh. Clever. Okay, now thinking about how we actually got here, such a significant level of debt, the interview touched on how tax and spending have kind of ebbed and flowed over the last few decades.
Yes, it's quite a contrast, actually. If you look at the early years of New Labour, say 1997 to about 2001,
Yeah.
the government was actually taking in more money than it was spending. We had public finance surpluses.
Gosh, feels like a long time ago.
Doesn't it? Very different from the situation for most of the time since. And the period around, say, 2003, 2004 seems to have been a key turning point.
Okay, how so?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. The interview suggests that around that time, government spending really started to ramp up significantly.
Right.
And apparently, there wasn't a particularly strong political pushback against this trend at the time.
Why was that, do you think?
Well, that's a crucial point raised. With the Conservative Party maybe in a less dominant opposition role back then, the overall political direction seemed to favor increased government expenditure.
Okay.
But as the Taxpayers Alliance gained more of a public profile, they apparently realized that just pointing out problems wasn't enough.
You can't just complain, you need answers.
Exactly. So this led them to shift their focus towards proposing actual solutions, things the government could potentially do.
And that shift, that's what led to their single income tax report in 2012.
That's the one. Yeah.
So what's the main idea behind that proposal, the single income tax?
The core idea is basically to tax income only once, as it flows through the economy.
Okay, simplify things.
Hugely. The principle is, say, if a business reinvests its profits back into the business, that money wouldn't be taxed at that point.
Right.
Taxation would only happen when that income is actually distributed to individuals, as wages, dividends, other forms of personal income. And crucially, it would be taxed just once.
So if that ever happened, a whole load of the taxes we currently have would just disappear.
A significant number, yes. The report specifically suggested getting rid of taxes like inheritance tax.
Always controversial.
Always.
Yeah.
Stamp duty land tax, the tax you pay when you buy property.
Which gums up the housing market, people say.
That's the argument.
Well,
Also, air passenger duty, the tax on airline tickets, and various other levies that they see as potentially holding back economic activity or being just overly complex.
and the thinking behind such a massive simplification. What would be the main upsides, according to them?
Well, the primary arguments are, first, it would boost economic growth.
Yeah.
By encouraging businesses to invest rather than getting taxed on reinvested profits.
Okay.
Second, it would create a much simpler, more transparent tax system, easier for everyone to understand.
Which builds trust, maybe.
That's the third point. Ultimately, it could build more trust because people could see clearly how the system works, that everyone's playing by the same, simpler rules without all the complex loopholes that often pop up in more complicated tax codes.
Right.
The aim is really a system that encourages productivity, investment, and is just fundamentally fairer and easier to grasp.
Okay. Let's pivot slightly to how things feel right now. Because there's definitely this widespread sense, isn't there, that various public services, well, they aren't performing as well as people expect or need them to. The interview touched on this feeling.
Absolutely. That sentiment that everything is breaking, whether it's the NHS, schools, infrastructure, you name it. It's something a lot of people seem to be feeling.
Yeah.
And this feeling is kind of compounded by the fact that the amount of tax we're all paying, the overall tax burden, is also pretty high historically, which leads to a sense of real frustration, understandably.
Yeah, you're paying more, but feeling you're getting less. There was a strong point made in the interview about the perception of how the government manages the money it gets from taxpayers.
Yes, the feeling expressed was that there's a sense sometimes that the government views taxpayer money almost as its own pot to allocate.
Rather than something they're looking after for us.
Exactly. Rather than seeing it as a responsibility, a privilege almost, to manage carefully and wisely on behalf of the public. And that kind of perception, well, it can really damage the trust between the public and those in power.
Yeah.
And it feeds into that feeling of a disconnect between the taxes people pay and the quality of the services they actually receive.
And the discussion also highlighted that just, throwing more money at these problems isn't necessarily the silver bullet. The NHS was used as a key example.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, isn't it? The idea that simply increasing the budget for public services doesn't automatically guarantee better outcomes.
It's not just about the inputs.
Precisely. The argument was made that a system like the NHS, for instance, might need fundamental changes to how it operates, its structures, its incentives, rather than just constant increases in funding to really improve its performance for patients.
It was also interesting that the interview mentioned reasons why people might choose to leave the UK that aren't directly about tax levels.
That's right. Things like crime rates, the general quality of public services, those were brought up as significant influences on where people decide to live and work.
So it's a bigger picture than just the tax rate.
Definitely. While tax is certainly a consideration, especially for higher earners or businesses, it's often not the only factor that affects people's decisions about relocating.
The idea of the government being involved in far too much also came up. And there was a reference, wasn't there, to a somewhat surprising statement from a past conservative election plan.
Yes, the 2015 Conservative Manifesto apparently claimed to have a plan for every stage of your life.
Wow, cradle to grave almost.
That was highlighted as an example of the government perhaps overreaching its proper role, and the discussion then gave specific, maybe slightly absurd-sounding examples, like government-funded initiatives for toothbrush coordinators.
Toothbrush coordinators,
Yeah.
really?
Apparently so. Used to illustrate the point that government involvement can sometimes extend into areas that many people might see as being well outside its core responsibilities. Is that really the best use of taxpayer money?
So if we're talking about making these big changes to the tax system, like the single income tax idea,
Hmm.
the interview suggests that this is really closely linked to making bigger political changes too, about the role of the state itself.
Absolutely. The argument is that to really reform the tax system in a meaningful way, you almost have to think about the fundamental size and scope of what the government is actually trying to do.
You can't separate tax from spending.
Exactly. You can't significantly change how the government raises money without also considering what it's spending that money on and whether it should be spending it on that at all.
And the amount of tax the government is currently taking, it's pretty high in historical terms, isn't it? Getting close to levels we haven't seen since, what, just after the Second World War?
That's correct. The total tax take is approaching, I think the figure mentioned was around 38% of the UK's total economic output, or GDP.
So nearly 40p in every pound generated goes to the government.
Roughly,
Yeah.
yes. And the Taxpayers Alliance suggests that a more appropriate, maybe healthier level would be for the government to raise and spend around a third of GDP, so maybe 33%.
Okay.
So for every £3 the economy produces, the government takes and spends one. The current level, approaching 38%, is seen by them as quite substantial and potentially damaging to growth.
The interview also touched on the difficult spot that the person in charge of the country's finances, the chancellor,
Yeah.
often finds themselves in. It's not an easy job.
No, the chancellor faces a really tough balancing act. They're often constrained by promises made before elections, spending commitments or pledges not to raise certain taxes,
Yeah.
while at the same time they need to find ways to bring in enough money to actually fund public services and manage the debt.
And the point was made that ultimately all taxes are paid by people, right? It's not like businesses pay tax in a vacuum.
Exactly. That's a crucial point they emphasized. Whether it's through higher prices, because businesses have to pass on their costs,
Or lower wages.
or lower wages, if employers can't afford to pay as much after taxes, or smaller returns on investments and pensions, there isn't really this separate entity called business that magically absorbs tax costs. Those costs always filter down to individuals, to people.
Okay. Now, one idea that often comes up in these discussions is, well, why not just increase taxes on the wealthiest people more? What were the arguments against that idea presented in the discussion?
Right. While the idea of taxing the wealthy more is often popular, the discussion highlighted a couple of key practical challenges.
Okay.
Firstly, the actual amount of extra money the government might realistically collect. Well, it might not be as large as some people hope. Wealth can be complex, mobile,
Hard to pin down.
sometimes, yes. And secondly, there's a real risk, and this is the big one, that very wealthy individuals and, crucially, businesses might choose to simply move.
Right. Capital flight.
Exactly. Move to countries where the tax burden is lower, taking their wealth, their investments, potential jobs with them.
The example of Dennis Healey, a former labor chancellor, struggling to actually implement a wealth tax back in the 70s was mentioned. That seemed quite telling.
It really does underscore how historically difficult it has been to make broad wealth taxes work effectively in practice, certainly in the UK context.
And other countries have tried and given up.
Yes, the fact that several countries that did have wealth taxes have actually decided to scrap them. Well, it further illustrates the practical problems and potential negative economic consequences they can create. It's not straightforward.
So instead of this sort of zero-sum approach to wealth where one person's gain is automatically seen as another's loss, what alternative was put forward?
The interview argued strongly in favor of policies that aim to boost the overall economy, to grow the pie, essentially.
Rather than just arguing about slicing it up differently.
Precisely. The idea is that if the economy grows and becomes more prosperous overall, then potentially everyone can benefit, rather than just focusing on trying to redistribute a fixed amount of wealth.
So creating an environment for investment.
Yes, encouraging investment, innovation, the creation of new jobs, policies focused on growth.
There sometimes seems to be a bit of a negative perception, doesn't there, of people who actually run businesses and create jobs? Was that something that was discussed?
Yes, the discussion did point out a perception that business owners, despite being key to creating jobs and economic activity, are sometimes portrayed negatively.
Compared to, say, sports stars or entertainers.
Exactly. This was contrasted with the often more positive view of wealth generated in other areas, like entertainment or professional sports. There can be a bit of a demonization sometimes, it was suggested.
And it was noted as well that the highest earners,
Yeah.
they already pay a really significant chunk of all the income tax collected, don't they?
That's right. A striking statistic mentioned was that the top 1% of income earners in the UK currently contribute something like 28% of all income tax revenue.
Wow, nearly a third from just 1% of earners.
It really highlights the potential risk to the government's finances if a significant number of these higher earners were to decide to leave the country because of very high taxes. It's a concentrated source of revenue.
The discussion also made a point about how taxes affect businesses outside the big financial centers, particularly outside London, the everyday businesses.
Absolutely. The interview stressed that it's really important to think about how taxes, like business rates, the tax on commercial property and employers' national insurance contributions, how they affect ordinary high street businesses.
Your local cafe, the hairdresser?
Exactly. Local cafes, hairdressers, pubs, small manufacturers. These taxes can have a really significant impact on their ability to grow, to hire more people, sometimes even just to stay afloat, especially when margins are tight.
There's also this fairly common belief, or maybe assumption, that the current levels of government spending are just essential, that they must be maintained. What was the counter-argument to that in the interview?
Well, the discussion really challenged that assumption. It argued that there needs to be a more fundamental questioning of why the government is spending the amounts it currently is.
Not just how to pay for it.
Precisely. Are these expenditures actually efficient? Are they focused on the right priorities? Is the government doing things it doesn't need to be doing? The focus shouldn't just be on how to fund the current level of spending, but also on whether that level itself is appropriate and whether the money is being used effectively, questioning the spending itself.
Okay. Moving on slightly to how well the government itself operates. The civil service is mentioned, and there were some questions raised about efficiency and maybe incentives.
Yes, there was a discussion around, how do you attract the most talented individuals to work in government? And there was even a suggestion floated, quite radically perhaps, to link the pay of members of parliament directly to how the economy is performing, perhaps tying it to the growth in GDP per person.
Right. Incentivize them to focus on growth.
That was the idea. But the broader point was made that simply increasing salaries across the board without also looking at the underlying ways things are structured and the incentives within the system might not automatically lead to better results or better government.
There was a pretty striking comparison made, wasn't there, between different areas of government spending or roles?
Yes, the contrast drawn between, for example, the apparently relatively low salary being advertised for a crucial role, like head of cybersecurity in a key government department,
Yeah.
compared to potentially much higher pitched roles focused perhaps on things like diversity and inclusion within, say, the NHS. It really raised questions about government priorities and the value it places on different kinds of expertise. Is the money going to the most critical areas?
But on the other hand, the vaccine rollout was mentioned as an example of efficiency.
Yes, the efficient rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, which famously involved cutting through a lot of the usual red tape and bureaucracy,
Right.
that was given as an example of what the government can achieve when unnecessary bureaucracy is stripped away and there's a clear, urgent focus.
Okay. The interview then moved on to suggesting some pretty significant actions are needed, including reforming laws that are already on the books.
Yes, the need for drastic action to change the UK's current economic path was strongly emphasized. This wasn't just tinkering around the edges.
No.
No. It even included the idea of something like a repeal act.
A repeal act. To do what?
To get rid of what were described in the interview as bad laws legislation, seen as hindering growth or causing unintended negative consequences.
Which ones were mentioned?
Examples given included the Equality Act 2010, the Climate Change Act 2008, and the Human Rights Act. These were singled out as potentially needing repeal or significant reform.
Wow, those are some major pieces of legislation. The example of Birmingham Council getting into financial difficulty was used to illustrate some of the unexpected problems that can arise from existing laws.
Yes, the financial issues faced by Birmingham Council, which were widely reported as being linked to huge equal pay claims made under the Equality Act.
Right.
That situation was presented as an example of how laws, even those intended to have positive effects, can sometimes lead to significant and unforeseen financial consequences for public bodies.
And it can slow things down, too.
Well, the interview also touched on how the requirement for public sector organizations to conduct things like equality impact assessments for their decisions, how that can sometimes gum up the work, slowing down, or complicating government processes and decision making.
The importance of sorting out our own domestic issues first was also highlighted as a priority, wasn't it? Getting our own house in order.
Absolutely. Addressing these internal challenges, things like the high cost of energy, the burden of taxes, what are seen as excessive regulations, was presented as crucial
Mhm.
so that the UK can be in a stronger position to deal with the wider global challenges and opportunities it faces. Fix the foundations first.
But making those changes is hard politically.
Hugely difficult.
Yeah.
The political challenge of making these necessary changes, often due to entrenched vested interests and just the general resistance to changing the status quo, was definitely acknowledged. It's easy to say, harder to do.
The discussion then shifted to how serious the current economic situation might actually be. And some comparisons were drawn with, well, quite a difficult period in the past.
Yes, the 1970s were mentioned as a period that shares some, perhaps worrying similarities with today.
Such as?
Well, including the fact that the UK actually had to go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout during that decade.
Gosh, yeah, the winter of discontent era.
That sort of era. And the current increase in the amount of tax being taken as a percentage of the overall economy, the tax burden getting back towards those levels seen in the 1970s, was noted as a potential reason for concern.
There was also a mention of what economic experts, academics, think about the sort of ideal level of taxes, if there is such a thing.
Yes, research from economists looking at what tax rates are best for overall societal well-being versus what rates are best specifically for maximizing economic growth.
Oh.
It suggests that the rates that maximize growth tend to be lower, often cited in the low 20% range as a percentage of GDP, much lower than where we are now.
And the current low growth figures we see.
Well, the fact that current very low rates of growth in the UK's GDP are sometimes presented by politicians as good news, that was questioned.
Because we should be aiming higher.
Exactly. The argument was that much higher growth rates are needed and potentially achievable to really improve the economy and living standards, and that reducing tax and regulation burdens is key to unlocking that growth.
So, okay, if there are these seemingly straightforward-sounding solutions being talked about, simplify tax, reduce regulation, aim for growth, why aren't they just being put into practice? The interview explored some of the possible reasons for this inertia.
Yeah, it's the big question, isn't it? Several factors were considered, including a potential reluctance by politicians, maybe particularly if the government is from a more left-leaning party, to cut taxes specifically on businesses.
Politically difficult.
Potentially, yes. But also, perhaps more fundamentally, there's a deeply ingrained way of thinking, a sort of institutional mindset within the Treasury.
Ah, the Treasury, the government department that holds the purse strings. Their approach came under some scrutiny.
Yes, quite a bit. The Treasury is often seen, or was portrayed in the interview, as focusing primarily on what's called static modeling.
Static modeling, what's that?
It's basically looking at the immediate short-term impact of a tax change. If we change this tax rate, how much money will the government collect next year?
Right, the immediate budget impact.
Exactly. This was contrasted with the need for dynamic modeling, which tries to understand the longer-term effects of tax changes.
On things like growth and jobs.
Precisely. How will it affect economic growth, job creation, investment decisions, overall productivity over, say, 5 or 10 years? The suggestion was that this short-term static focus can sometimes prevent reforms that might cost a bit in year one, but would be hugely beneficial for the economy in the long run.
There was even a suggestion, quite radical again, that the Treasury itself, as it's currently structured, might have too much power. That it needs breaking up.
Yes, that argument was made, that the Treasury has such a strong centralized influence over all other government departments.
It controls money.
It controls the money. And because of that, it can act as a significant block, a significant obstacle to change, almost regardless of which political party is actually in power.
Liz Truss's brief time as PM was mentioned in relation to this.
Yes, it was noted that she had identified some of these issues with the Treasury's perceived orthodoxy or resistance to different approaches.
And this contributes to that public feeling that nothing really changes.
It can, yes. That feeling that whoever you vote for, The big, meaningful changes to how the country is run rarely seem to happen, partly because of these powerful institutional forces like the Treasury and the senior civil servants, the permanent secretaries, who often remain in place through changes of government.
Okay, let's talk about spending cuts then. Finding areas where government spending could actually be reduced is always the really hard part, isn't it? Where did the interview suggest looking for potential savings?
Well, while acknowledging it's never easy or popular, the discussion pointed inevitably towards the major areas where the government spends the most money.
The big ticket items.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things like welfare payments, the NHS healthcare budget, state pensions, and other similar entitlements. These are the areas where you'd need to make changes to really make a significant difference to the overall spending level.
And the debt interest payments came up again.
Yes, the sheer substantial increase in the amount of money the government now has to spend just on paying the interest on its accumulated debt.
How much is that now?
Mentioned as being over $100 billion a year, which is huge. About 10% of the entire government budget just servicing the debt.
Wow. And that's vulnerable to interest rate changes.
Very. Especially as it was noted that about a quarter of the UK's government debt is index-linked, meaning the payments go up automatically with inflation,
Gosh.
which makes the UK's finances particularly vulnerable to changes in interest rates and global economic shocks. However, the main point stressed again was that generating economic growth is the most effective, sustainable way to manage that debt burden in the long run. Growing the economy makes the debt smaller relative to our income.
The impact of all these taxes and regulations on actual businesses, small businesses, was brought to life with a personal story, wasn't it?
Yes, the experience of the interviewee, John O'Connell, in setting up and running a cafe was used to illustrate the real practical challenges.
Like what?
Things like business rates, the complexity and cost of employing people with minimum wage requirements, national insurance, pensions, and then value-added tax, VAT, on top of that. The point was made really strongly that the sheer weight of rules, regulations, and taxes that businesses face are often the biggest hurdles they have to overcome.
And that stops them growing.
It can certainly limit their ability to expand, to take risks, to hire new people, and create jobs. And this was connected to the experiences of other small business owners, too, like publicans, people running pubs.
They see high energy costs as well.
Exactly. High energy costs, council interference, licensing, all these pressures piling up on small businesses, which are often the lifeblood of local communities. There's a tension between the Treasury wanting revenue now and the long-term health of these businesses.
Okay, so when it came to specific big areas of spending, the really big ones, what kind of reforms were actually suggested, beyond just general cuts?
Well, some potential easier wins, relatively speaking, were mentioned first. Things like potentially removing access to social housing and certain welfare benefits for recent immigrants.
Okay, and the more significant reforms?
More significant reforms discussed included tackling public sector pensions, moving away from what are called defined benefit schemes.
Where the payout is guaranteed.
Yes, towards defined contribution schemes, which are now standard in the private sector, where the final pension depends on contributions and investment performance. Also, looking at the generosity of employer contributions in the public sector compared to the private.
And the NHS. That always comes up.
Yes, the NHS. Reforming the NHS was presented as an urgent necessity. The suggestion floated was perhaps moving towards a social insurance model.
Like they have in some European countries.
Exactly, similar to systems used in countries like the Netherlands or Germany, where funding might come more from specific insurance contributions rather than general taxation. But crucially, while still maintaining the core principle of universal healthcare access for everyone.
And the overall target remained that 33% figure.
Yes, the aim of getting both government spending and the overall tax burden down to around that 33% of GDP level was reiterated as a kind of benchmark for a healthier, more dynamic economy, according to their perspective.
Now, what about the order, the sequencing of these reforms? Should we cut spending first and then reform taxes? Or the other way around?
The argument put forward was actually that reforming the tax system first could help to drive the spending reforms.
How so?
By encouraging economic growth, a simpler tax system could generate more overall prosperity, which in turn creates more flexibility in the government's finances, potentially making spending decisions easier or less painful.
And tax reform could happen quicker.
Well, it was suggested that tax reform technically could be implemented relatively quickly, changing rates, abolishing taxes if there was the political will to actually do it, Spending reform often involves deeper, more complex service changes.
Let's talk about that complexity. The current tax code is famously enormous, isn't it? How could it realistically be made simpler?
Yeah, the sheer size of the UK tax code, mentioned as approaching 25,000 pages, was highlighted as a major problem in itself, just unwieldy.
And the government body meant to simplify it hasn't worked.
Apparently not. The fact that the government's own Office for Tax Simplification hasn't really achieved significant simplification over the years was also noted. It's a tough nut to crack.
So what's the answer then? How do you
Yeah.
simplify 25,000 pages?
Well, the main suggestion for making things genuinely simpler was pretty blunt. Get rid of entire taxes, especially taxes that are complex, unpopular, and don't actually bring in a huge amount of revenue relative to the hassle they cause.
And inheritance tax was the prime example again.
Yes, inheritance tax was presented as Exhibit A.
Why?
Well, despite apparently making up over 10% of the length of the tax code, all the rules and exemptions,
Yeah.
it only brings in less than 1% of the total amount of tax the government collects each year. Around 8 billion, maybe?
So huge complexity for relatively little revenue.
Yeah.
And it's unpopular.
Hugely unpopular. Its unpopularity across the political spectrum, even apparently among Green Party voters, with PhD holders being a notable exception, interestingly, was emphasized.
Why is it so disliked, do you think?
The strong, emotional, almost visceral opposition to it seems key, because it goes against that fundamental human desire, doesn't it? To work hard, save, and leave something behind for your children or family. Taxing it again at death feels wrong to many people.
And recent changes have made it more complicated.
Well, recent changes or discussions around removing some of the reliefs, like those for agricultural land or business property, were also discussed, with concerns raised about the potential negative impact on farmers being able to pass on farms or on family-owned businesses.
Stamp duty land tax, the tax on buying property, was also mentioned again as a candidate for the CHOP. Why is that one seen as so bad?
Stamp duty was described as potentially one of the most economically damaging taxes.
Really? Why?
Because of the negative way it affects the housing market and, crucially, people's ability to move for work-labor mobility.
It stops people moving.
It can, yeah. It can prevent people from taking new job opportunities in different parts of the country because the cost of moving house is so high due to stamp duty. Or it stops older people downsizing to more suitable homes. It just gums up the market.
And it's complicated, too.
Its current structure, with all the different rates depending on the property price, adds complexity as well. A personal anecdote was shared about the significant stamp duty costs incurred just when moving to a family home. It's a big chunk of money.
Okay, so if we got rid of those complex, unpopular taxes, in this ideal scenario, what would a good tax system actually look like? What's the positive vision?
The Taxpayers Alliance's single income tax proposal was really presented as the model for that simpler, better system.
Remind us of the key features.
It would involve having a single flat rate of income tax, maybe 30% was suggested in their report, a generous amount you can earn before you start paying any tax at all, a high personal allowance, and crucially, no distinction made between different types of income salary, dividends from shares, interest. It's all just income, taxed once at the same rate.
And company profits. Corporation tax.
Even corporation tax, the tax on company profits, would effectively be incorporated into this single income tax. Remember, profits are only taxed when they are distributed to individuals as income.
That sounds radically simpler. Is anywhere like that?
Well, it's very different from the UK's current super complicated system. It was compared favorably to somewhere like Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Yeah, which apparently has a tax code that's only around 250 pages long compared to our 25,000. And Hong Kong has a long history of strong economic performance, partly attributed to its low, simple, predictable tax system.
Predictability is important for businesses, isn't it?
Hugely. The benefits of a stable and simple tax system for encouraging investment and long-term planning were really highlighted. Contrast that with the uncertainty created by frequent budgets, autumn statements, and constant tinkering with the complex code. Businesses hate uncertainty.
Was Bulgaria mentioned?
Yes, an anecdote about Bulgaria's simplified tax return system was shared, apparently incredibly simple compared to ours. The point being, it is possible to do things much more simply. Some taxpayers, it was suggested, might even prefer a slightly higher overall tax rate if the system was drastically simpler, fairer, and more stable.
Okay, so the single income tax, flat rate, maybe 30%, high personal allowance, no difference between income sources, corporation tax folded in. What about VAT, the sales tax. Would that change?
Yes, the idea for V8 reform, again in the name of simplicity and neutrality, would be to move towards a single standard rate.
Applied to everything.
Ideally, yes. Applied across almost all goods and services to reduce complexity and distortions. Although it was acknowledged that removing the current zero rate on essentials like food or children's clothing would be extremely politically difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, taxing baby clothes would not go down well.
Exactly. But the underlying principle proposed is that the tax system should be neutral. It shouldn't be used as a tool to constantly try and achieve specific social policy goals or pick winners and losers. That's what makes it complicated.
And making the tax visible.
Yes, there was also a suggestion to actually show the amount of tax included in the price right there at the point of sale on the receipt.
Like they do in America.
Exactly, to make people much more aware of how much tax they're actually paying on everyday items. Increase transparency.
And if we had a much simpler system, like that single income tax,
Right.
what would be the impact on, say, HMRC, the tax collection department?
Well, a significantly simpler tax system would almost certainly lead to a substantial reduction in the size and complexity of HMRC.
Fewer rules to enforce.
Far fewer rules and regulations to administer, interpret, and enforce. Fewer loopholes to chase. Estonia was mentioned again here, a country with a relatively simple and efficient tax system, which apparently inspired some of the Taxpayers Alliance's proposals years ago.
So it's possible. But the main barrier isn't technical complexity. It's political.
Ultimately, yes. The main barrier to this kind of radical simplification and reform is seen as the current very high level of government spending. And the political focus is almost always on how to pay for that spending, rather than fundamentally questioning whether that level of spending is necessary, efficient, or even desirable in the first place. That's the roadblock.
So to wrap all that up then, we've taken a pretty deep look today at the considerable scale of the UK's financial challenges.
Yeah, and the compelling arguments being made, certainly by the Taxpayers Alliance in this case, for significant reforms to both our tax system and the levels and priorities of government spending.
And those potential advantages that a radical simplification of our, frankly, enormous tax code could offer: simplicity, growth, trust.
Yeah, lots to think about.
Which brings us to our final thought for you. Considering the sheer scale, the complexity, the interconnected nature of all the issues we've discussed today, what single change do you believe would have the biggest positive impact on the UK's future?
That's a big question.
It is a big question, we know. But maybe one worth considering after hearing all this.
And if you are interested in digging deeper into these specific ideas, maybe finding out more about the work of the Taxpayers Alliance,
Where can people go?
you can visit their website. It's taxpayersalliance.com. Simple as that.
Taxpayersalliance.com.
Yeah, and there you can, sign up for their weekly updates, see their research, learn how to support their campaigns if you want to.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complexities of the UK economy and the arguments around fixing it.
Thanks for listening.
Until our next exploration.